gang, back at it again with the old Gibsons. Yes, it does seem never-ending, doesn't it? Well, believe me, you're only seeing like less than 1/10 of the actual time spent and the effort involved. There's a lot of sanding I don't put you through. But these things have a sort of natural pace to them. Sometimes working on several similar jobs at once feels like the right thing to do. Logically, it would appear to be more efficient, but in repair work, no two guitars are ever the same, even when working on identical models like I am here. Each has its own set of challenges. You're doing the same stuff over and over again, but variations on the theme. Repairing or building, anything to do with stringed instruments, it involves this complex series of operations that are sometimes interlocking. Like, you got to do the one thing before you move on to the other, otherwise you're causing serious problems for yourself, 5 steps down the line. And if you're working on 3 major repairs at the same time, it can get compounded. So you've got to keep track and continuously check on yourself to make sure that you're not, you haven't missed something in the guitar that you're working on, which you already did in another one. So the assembly line analogy doesn't really work here. It kind of breaks down. Some people flourish under those conditions. Others find that it actually negates the supposed efficiency. And maybe they'd be better off working at only one thing at a time. In the worst case scenario, you're probably like me, which is naturally inconsistent. Sometimes I function best doing a whole bunch of stuff at the same time. Other times I need to put all the energy into doing just one thing. And it's this fluctuating internal schedule that you never really get a beat on. Eventually everything gets done, but you never know until you're halfway into a project whether you've made the right choice to do it one way or the other. Add to that the vagaries of trying to film the whole thing and present it in such a way that it's easy for the viewer to follow along and also kind of enjoyable to watch. That's a tall order. I don't want to show the same things over and over again. So I try to pick moments that are novel, something you haven't seen for each of these videos. I think we're getting pretty close on some of these guitars. Now here's another thought for aspiring young repair people. When you're starting off, I would encourage you to perhaps take on many smaller jobs or one big one, because cash flow becomes a bit of an issue if things are going to stretch for longer than a month. I know this seems intuitive, but when you're just starting off, the urge is to take on everything that shows up at the door. You don't want to say no to anything. Yeah, I think I'm ready to glue the new bridge onto the J45 here. Now, there's going to be a bit of a trough around the bridge because the outline of the previous oversized bridge was scraped and sanded pretty deep into the top, to the point where I'd never be able to build up the touch-up finish high enough to reconcile with the surrounding lacquer. It would be sitting in a film that was like 15 thousandths deep. I don't want to put that much lacquer on. And there'd be no graceful way to remove the bridge again in the future, if it ever needed it, without destroying the bridge or the lacquer. So this is one thing we're going to live with. It's got about 6 coats of finish on it. That's enough. Here's a case in point. How many times can I describe this operation within the scope of a single run of videos on one project? It's tough sometimes because there are people who really want to see me do everything, like all the minutia, every little thing, to the extent that they would really only be satisfied with a live stream where I had 4 or 5 cameras on me for hours at a time. But then there are others who, they don't want me to talk at all. I use too many big words, blah, 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 etc. They likely watch the first and last 30 seconds of a 25-minute video. And then, of course, there are the others who probably set them to 1.5 speed and get a frenetic version of me with extra caffeine. YouTube has really been pushing to get people to make shorts. I think they're funneling advertising in that direction, but I just can't bring myself to do it, None of this is soundbite worthy, and I'm not going to chop things up to fit that format. Most of my videos, they're like novellas rather than short stories. This doesn't feel like hide glue. I think it was probably re-glued at some point using an aliphatic type resin, hopefully. It's stickier. You know, there's some people who like to run a bead of solder right across the top of the fret that they're going to remove. And I've never really understood why. I mean, I can understand it would hold some heat, but it seems like a lot of extra work. I don't get the benefit. Heat probes. Engage. Well, this is another one of those Gibson necks that's being very obstinate. Worked on it for a long time and there's no real movement. However, a little crack has appeared on both sides in one grain line of the side, which usually suggests that something along the top part of the neck or the dovetail is holding on, because the neck itself is being pushed up and this can pull that along with it. It's not a bad crack, we'll do okay. Assuming we can get it off. So I'm putting a little water in the joint. This may not be the first time the neck has been taken off and put back on, and sometimes people like to put a whole lot of glue on the front surface of the heel, which is really kind of a nasty trick for the next person, because it's hard to get that whole area hot enough. And yeah, had a gentleman contact me last week, earlier this week maybe, saying that he was working on a 1930s Gibson Kalamazoo, and he was running into issues that it wasn't coming apart like it does in the videos, and I said sometimes they don't. Of course, the other danger is that this might be one of those dreaded ones where the top was glued on top of the dovetail. We shall see. So I'm going to let this sit here for about 20 minutes and soak up that water. Try again. Remember, this is the one that's got the two cracks that was running up on either side of the block, which usually suggests that funny business has occurred and that it's not the first rodeo. Other possibilities include, but are not limited to, someone trying to put this thing back together with epoxy. You want to make good friends, try to defend that idea at your local luthiers meeting. They love it. And last but not least, this is kind of sad to say, but Gibson has at various times had employees who maybe were not so conscientious about putting the necks on the bodies, and rather than going for a nice tight fit, they go for what the engineers would call an interference fit. Especially in the 20s and 30s, it's really weird to see the dovetail pockets in Gibson guitars because they were cut on a table saw with multiple passes, like 25 passes on an 1/8-inch saw blade, varying the angle with each pass to cut the dovetail pocket. It must have been a really interesting jig. But those are pretty standard, as are the tenons, but they, for some reason, don't always fit together, and it's as if someone hammered them into place, to the point where they're locked together in a way that just doesn't want to come out without breakage. So we hope that's not the case. Well, this thing has had more than enough time and heat to come to terms with the idea that it should be coming apart, but it really has not budged. And I don't want to force it any farther, otherwise these side cracks are going to move out too far. So I'm going to take this off, let it cool down, and I think I'm wondering what the next step should be. Whether I try to cut through at the 15th fret or just pull the whole extension off. Cut through at the 12th fret maybe, or 13th. Because it ain't coming off this way. Getting things ready for paint. I've got the sides covered in paper. Strange though it may seem, in a repair situation, sometimes less masking is more. The initial assumption is to tape everything off, and then sometimes that can cause more problems than it solves because, well, everywhere the tape ends, you develop this hard line of lacquer. It's a step between two surfaces. And blending that in can be difficult sometimes. You know, it's just easier to let the overspray happen and then clean it up afterwards with sanding and buffing. In this case, though, where the edges are going to end up dark up against a different color on the sides, it just makes sense. As for the binding and the rosette, this stuff here, I mean, could you tape it? Yeah, it'll take all day, and you're still going to mess it up. That's not how they did it at the factory. You know, they just sprayed over it and then scraped it back before adding clear coats afterwards. So that's what I'll do. I've got to tint the center first here before doing the dark edges. And when it comes to these things, I'm not sure there is a right color because they've all aged in such different ways, depending on how much light and smoke they've experienced over the years. You know, the color shifts from batch to batch and from year to year too. So the J45 from 1946 is kind of this lighter pumpkin color, where the 1951 SJ has much more red in it. You know, many of them are more on the yellow spectrum. Something like a dark yellowy amber is what I'm going for in the center. And I'm going to use rattle cans. I'm not suggesting you do this. It's not a tutorial because I'm doing this indoors, and you really, if you're going to do it indoors, you really want a spray booth. Because this is nasty stuff I'm working with, and in high enough concentrations the vapor is flammable, very flammable, and possibly even explosive. I'm not going to sit here and go back and forth, you know, filling the room with a big cloud. These are going to be very light passes, and I stop, let things settle for a while, come back and do some more. You know, I've got my respirator and goggles and everything I have, but, you know, you really want to be doing this outside on a nice hot summer's day in New Mexico or Arizona, because hot and dry is the place to be, not the dead of winter, but got to get it done. I'm using a tangerine color and a dark amber that are designed to mimic the really old Fender headstock colors, which I think is pretty close to what I've seen on the other guitars. Gibson didn't put a lot of effort into completely sealing off the sound hole before they sprayed. They probably put some newspaper on the back sometimes, and in many cases you'll see there's a lot of overspray that's made it inside the guitar, and the color has ended up on the sort of the braces that are next to the sound hole. I use a balloon. In this case it's got a happy face on it. I glued up the side cracks in the region of the neck block, and I've cleated them as well to keep this together because I've decided I'm going to give it one more try before I cut through the fingerboard and remove a section. I'm going to use steam this time, the heavy-duty stuff. The reason so many of us have been getting into using the heat probes is on these old guitars, the steam can really make a mess of the finish if it gets loose in this area. In this case, I don't really have to worry about being the one who messes this up. I'm going to airbrush some color on it before I'm done anyways, so steam it is. The other thing I'm going to do is assume that this does have the soundboard glued on over top of the dovetail, rather than it just being a super tight hammer fit. And I'm going to partially cut through the fret slot in the center here in the region of the dovetail, and down through what would be the thickness of the soundboard underneath. I'm also going to make a cut through the soundboard along either side of the fingerboard up to that 15th fret. So in the event that the soundboard is under there, it is glued in place, and we have to push through it, it will, rather than coming off the block on either side or possibly damaging or cracking, it'll break along the little line that I'm cutting here. Not a big deal in this case, again, because I'm going to be doing touch-up work anyway. And, you know, we'll give it one last fighting try before I have to cut it off. Having the neck already off on a similar vintage, I know that the dovetail is about 35 millimeters wide, which is about 1 3/8 at the top edge here. And it starts about 9 millimeters in from the edge of the fingerboard, which is about where I drilled my holes previously. Because when I'm drilling through for my heat probes, I want them to be fairly close to the edge of the dovetail itself. Little homemade Japanese saw here. On the Dazukis, at a certain point you'll break off a tooth or two, or the saw will get bent and just not work as well. But usually the ones that are down towards the handle, are in good shape because I don't see as much use. So I'll just nip it off with some tin snips and make a little miniature like this. It's good because it fits into the fret slot with no problem, and very thin. And it works on the pull stroke, which is nice in this case. I don't know. Feels like there might be wood under there. Okay, went through in that spot. The other way to do this, I picked this up from Ian Davlin, is to get a razor blade. Single edge, of course. I'm very annoyed that I did not press record somehow while I had my cappuccino maker steaming away with big clouds of steam, me wearing a leather glove, wiping off all of the accumulating moisture, and the finish blushed white almost immediately, which I kind of expected it would. I gave it some gusto, and here you see me pushing and pulling and pushing and pulling. No dice. Would not move. Still wouldn't come up. Okay, this is why we don't like the steam. This is all turned white and ghosty. Most of that will probably go away. It'll come out again. And it's also kind of cooked the glue in the cracks that I repaired earlier today, which is great. I also managed to compress the heel about a 1/16 of an inch. It's actually squished down, as I've mentioned in previous videos. This was so much pressure on here. But of course the heel did not budge, not at all. There is no movement up at the top. Just fun. I'm sawing through at the 13th fret, so there'll be support under the seam between the two pieces when I glue it back together. Checking the depth frequently so I don't cut into the neck. And finally, the moment of truth. I was a little incredulous because this isn't a top-over guitar. It's just a ridiculously tight neck, somehow. There was a bunch of gunk in the pocket, but, you know, it looks like a standard dovetail. I used a long, thin palette knife to work into the line between the dovetail members. It was completely tight, of course. There's basically nothing, there's no space between the parts. And there was no way I could safely cut all the way down to the bottom, but I got about halfway. Still wouldn't budge. So I drilled 2 more holes close to the side, figuring the front of the heel was probably glued to the sides, which turned out to be true. So another round of heat. I had to load it back in the jig and put more pressure on it before it finally came free. Well, this is one of the most difficult ones I've ever done, I think. It'll go back together. But what a struggle. Rid of some of this gunk in there. Looking inside here, I can immediately see there's some really thick shims at play. And depending on the species of wood, this may be poplar or something like holly. It's fairly light in color. If they're very compressible and the neck is put in really tight, the glue can hit it and it'll basically act like, well, it'll swell up and then stay there, locking things in place even harder than they normally would be. The other thing that I would note is that this entire front surface is sticky with glue, and you can see that the front of the block, there are wood fibers from it which have torn off on both sides, meaning that this entire surface was glued to the side of the guitar, which is, that's a lot of material. I couldn't get it hot enough to slide all of this. There wasn't enough heat and or moisture to make that move. Well, I think I'm going to call this one a day. That's probably a good place to stop. I've got to let the dovetail pocket dry out on that other one, and I got finish curing, and we'll get there eventually. Thanks for watching. See you again soon.